Welcome to the Sports Trading Card Hall of Fame. Today I want to tell you the story of a player who was he was one of the biggest contributions in the history of sports cards, and yet it's easy to forget about him because of his brief period of relevance, and more significantly, the fact that he got superseded by an even bigger star almost right away. And the story can easily get kind of forgotten under the luster of all of the big stars that we've had over time that have had great storied careers that have lasted a long time. They have the stats, they have the trophies, all of that is in place. But the story of Bo Jackson is not that way, because what he was not one of the great athletes of any one individual sport. He was never the greatest at anything. And yet he was better than all of them. He was more significant. He was more impressive. He is the only story that is at all like this, because he's not even a baseball player or a football player. He is folklore. He is literally a part of the American folklore. And in the American lexicon, we have Paul Bunyan, we have Johnny Appleseed, we have Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone. We have these heroes from our past. Some are real, some probably not so much, they're a part of the tapestry of where we were. But these individuals come from a time that we can't really access. They're just words. That's all they are. Maybe there's a photograph, or maybe just a painting, but for the most part, all we have are words, and those words can go in wild different directions. In the world of the visual that we're now in, of recorded video and photography, etc., we can't really have that, because all of the things that make somebody larger than life, they're impossible to hide, except they're actually not. And that's what's fascinating about Bo Jackson, is the fact that Bo was not supposed to exist. What he was and what he could potentially be wasn't supposed to happen. And yet it did, and we were able to be there for it. We were able to enjoy it. Now, the best way to start the story in talking about Bo Jackson in relation to card collecting is to talk about the history of the Beckett magazines. So these are the Beckett monthlies, and they started out in 1984 with Roberto Clemente on the cover of the first one. Now, the reason for Roberto Clemente was the fact that in the mid-'80s, the whole point of card value and the card market was vintage cards. It was older cards. And so Roberto Clemente was one of the great classic players. You know, you could have Mickey Mantle or Roger Maris or Hank Aaron. You could have lots of different superstars from bygone time on the cover of one of these magazines, because that was where people really collected. Everybody was looking backwards. But by the end of the decade, that was not the case anymore. And the reason for that was because the whole card world had evolved. All of a sudden, you now had card shops. A few existed in the past, but in the mid-'80s, you were still more going to coin and stamp stores to really get into the card trading world, the individual card purchasing world. By the end of the decade, it had evolved into where we had card shows all over the place. We had card shops all over the place. There was a thriving market of new cards, new players, and we were focused on what was happening at the time. So by the time that the Beckett magazine came out for basketball, well, we had Michael Jordan on the cover. Jordan was in the discussion for the greatest player in the history of basketball. When the first Beckett magazine came out for hockey, it had Wayne Gretzky, who was at the time in the discussion of the greatest hockey player of all time. And when the first football Beckett came out, for the first Beckett monthly for football, it came out with Joe Montana on the cover, who was in the discussion for the greatest of all time, except Joe was actually on the second cover. He wasn't on the first cover. On the first cover, they had Bo Jackson. And Bo Jackson was he the greatest ever? Well, no, he wasn't even the best running back on his team, believe it or not. And that was part of what was so intriguing about Bo, is the fact that in football, like I said, he was not the best player on his team. He wasn't the best player at his position. But over in baseball, he was still not the best player on his team. I mean, they had George Brett, for crying out loud. So, but the big thing was that Bo Jackson was still one of the top players on each of his teams and in each of his sports. He was a player who could be in the All-Star game and in the Pro Bowl. And it was fascinating to watch this, because it wasn't that he was so heavily skilled. It was that he was this freak of nature that could do things that you just couldn't imagine. And it was so exciting. We were so fired up about it. And that freak of nature quality, which really defined his popularity and his presence, that is really where the story of Bo is at its core. Because Marcus Allen was a much better running back. Marcus Allen knew how to earn his yards by creating his yards. Bo knew how to earn his yards by just flat taking him. And it was incredible to watch. And then over in baseball, Bo wasn't the best hitter. He was a lot of fun to watch, because when he made contact with the ball, it was exciting. When he didn't make contact with the ball, it was actually very commonplace. But he was a good outfielder. He was a good enough hitter. He was a very good base stealer. He did all the things that he needed to do at a top level, but not at a premier level. But the fact is, he could do things that you could never imagine, and that was what really intrigued us. And that actually supported a legend that existed that, like I said, it wasn't supposed to exist. See, Bo Jackson he didn't grow up in the limelight. He was very much out in a rural environment where storytelling can get kind of interesting. And so it's easy to hear these fabulous stories and just kind of toss them aside. I mean, one of the great stories is that as a kid, Bo Jackson jumped over a 40-foot ditch. Now, you would listen to that and go, well, that's stupid. But then we watched him in baseball, and we watched him in football, and we went, come on, 40 feet, really? And that's the thing, is when you watched him in action, when you actually saw him in a game, it changed your perspective of what was potentially possible. And so you hear these ridiculous stories from the past, and it's not so much, was it true or not, as opposed to, well, I mean, if anybody did it, it'd obviously be this guy. And there were a lot of really crazy stories. He ran the fastest 40 in the history of pro days. And you hear that and you go, wow, that was, why isn't that down in the record books? Well, it's not down in the record books because they weren't keeping records of it. But at the same time, you saw him on the football field and went, well, okay, yeah, I think he could do it. Story after story after story. And we got to see evidence of it. We actually got to see things happen. Whether it was running for a touchdown so fast he couldn't stop and he ran into the tunnel, or, for crying out loud, throwing out Harold Reynolds from the warning track. Well, okay, throwing a baseball from the warning track to home plate, players could do that without a single hop, a clean shot, right almost directly to home plate, and without cocking your arm. That's the thing. He would run up and down a wall. You would see him do things that superheroes do. And then you look back at those fables and you go, oh, again, if anybody could do it, it would be him. That was the thing that was so amazing, was the fact that, yeah, you could actually kind of believe it. And amazingly, for all of the mystique of this, all of the excitement of this, he didn't even have to promote this. Now, Deion Sanders was also, of course, a two-sport star, but Deion had to invent his own hype, and he conned us into thinking he's a lot better than he actually was. He invented his own nicknames. He built all this persona around him. Bo didn't do that. He rarely ever talked about his past, and usually when he did, he was talking it down. You should hear some of the interviews. 40-foot ditch, he backs off and said, no. It was only 20 feet, and I jumped from the high side of the low side. Of course, he just jumped over a 20-foot ditch. That makes a lot more sense. But the casual nature of how he talks about it is what's really fun. The pro day, he talks about how he didn't want to do it. They basically, he was on his way to practice, they called him over, he ran it, and then he didn't want to do anything more of the pro day, so he just kept running straight out of the stadium. He said that there were 3 stopwatches, and they all had different times, and even the slowest of the stopwatches was still ridiculously fast. But for him, it's just like, yeah, I was just on my way to practice. I didn't want to have to do that. So, he didn't warm up. He didn't do any of that. He didn't stretch. He wasn't wearing the right clothes. The casualness of it is it's absolutely fascinating. If you hear him talk about throwing out Harold Reynolds, all he says is, well, I knew he was fast, so I had to get the ball to home plate. That's it. Duh. Running up and down the wall of the outfield, well, he did it as a kid. Running through into the tunnel in the football game, well, he couldn't stop in time. The matter of factness, there was a humility to him that was absolutely fascinating. Now, Michael Jordan has a certain level of humility himself. And once you pick yourself up off of the floor from laughing so hard, understand, Jordan very rarely goes out and tells people how great he is. His idea was, you go out there, you prove it on the court. If somebody needs to be taught how good you are, you go out and you prove it to them. You bury their nose in it and they know. You don't have to tell them, you just show it off. And then on rare occasions you may comment on it. But for Michael, he really did wear it on his sleeve. He didn't necessarily promote it, but he definitely made sure that it was obvious. Bo, on the other hand, was the opposite. He wasn't embarrassed by it, but he was kind of like Dale Earnhardt Jr., where he's really talented and it's like he hasn't figured out he's supposed to be a superstar. And that down-to-earth quality just makes it all even better. So Bo Jackson was so much fun because he was the right kind of hero and he was a larger-than-life hero, and then he was a mythical figure at the same time. Here we were. You listen to stories about, say, Red Grange or Babe Ruth or Jim Thorpe. You hear about these stories of people from the early part of the 20th century, and they're incredible, but that's because all we have are words, and words can change. We're at the end of the 20th century, and it's all the same thing. This one guy has somehow managed to be a mythical creature. And the popularity that came from that was a big part of it. So if you go back to the early 20th century, you had players like Red Grange. Now, Red Grange was not the greatest player ever. He was really good, but everybody heard about him. And so the Chicago Bears put together a barnstorming where they just went around the country playing football games, and everybody heard, Red Grange is here, now I get to see him. And they flocked to watch Red Grange play. And it taught the entire country, or it taught parts of the country, about professional football. And that was something that happened a lot in baseball too, where you would have a baseball player who was known by words around the country, maybe by radio. He'd travel around and he'd play pickup games, as it were, in different places, and people would flock to actually see the person. Now the person actually became tactile. Well, we were in a TV world where you can't hide, and we were doing the same thing. People would be flocking to see this incredible person. We could actually see it on TV. And the idea that he was an actual person was something that was just difficult to really wrap your head around. He was too big for the world of sports. And for us kids, we absolutely flocked to it. We couldn't get enough of it. Now, this is as cards were evolving from a baseball affair to an all-sport affair. And Bo Jackson was the right person to put on that first football cover because he was a player that all baseball collectors knew, and football collectors, the budding football collectors certainly knew too. We could converge on one place. We could have a conversation. But look, if you were a basketball collector, you knew who Bo Jackson was, and you wanted some of his cards. Hockey, same thing. He was that one point where we all kind of came together, and it was incredible. It drove us all, and some of his cards were truly legendary. And then all of a sudden it was over. It was gone. It was just done. And it was not something we were ready for. Now, the big benefit to how history worked here was the fact that when he all of a sudden disappeared, that was right when Michael Jordan was stepping into that role of being the biggest athlete in the country. And so instead of losing Bo Jackson, we transitioned over to Michael Jordan. And then came a metamorphosis that we could not have imagined, which is that over the next couple of years, Bo Jackson went from superhuman to totally human. Every generation in cards is a lot briefer than you might think. The mid-'80s was a generation of cards, and then the junk wax era, we were a generation of cards. And then in the early to mid-'90s, that was a generation of cards. It's little clusters of time where activity goes on. And for lasting over 5 years, that's not the usual way that fads work. And so for us in the junk wax era, who grew up living and breathing Bo Jackson, all of a sudden the next group came in and they were more stat focused, and they were talking about Bo Jackson's stats and basically saying that Bo Jackson's stats show he wasn't very good. Now, stats you can use in any possible way that you want, but here's the statistic that is the easiest to really shut down any talk about how great Bo Jackson was, which is that he never had a 1,000-yard season. But what they fail to mention is that he never played in a full season. This is a guy who was never in an NFL training camp. He was never in an NFL preseason. He never played football in September, and in October he'd play a few games. But this is a guy who'd play an entire baseball season, and then he'd set down his mitt, he'd take off his cleats, fly to Oakland, put on his cleats, put on shoulder pads, and would run through guys like Neil Smith, Brian Bosworth, Reggie White, whoever happened to be standing in the way. Now, sure, you had Deion Sanders, who was doing something kind of similar, but Deion's just outrunning a track meet with Jerry Rice. Bo Jackson has to run through linebackers, and he could do that because he was a linebacker who just happened to be as fast as any corner. And it was incredible to watch. But also the statistics are difficult to really read because, yeah, sure, he never had a 1,000-yard season, but he also never played more than 12 games. And in truth, he definitely had some 1,000-yard equivalent seasons. This is a guy who averaged 5 yards per carry. Jim Brown, Barry Sanders did that. Barry Sanders did average 5 yards per carry. And Bo Jackson, there you go. There's the list. And that was what was so incredible about him, was the fact that he would start his season with spring training for baseball, and he would end it a few weeks before spring training for baseball. He would play through that entire year, and in football, he was still the biggest athlete in the game. And in baseball, as Deion Sanders likes to put it, he could hit the curve. He could actually play at an upper tier level in both sports. It was unreal. But sports is a lot easier to understand when it's actually happening. After the fact, all you're left with is a bunch of words. And where words at one time could get bigger and bigger over time, in sports, now they tend to go the opposite direction. We tend to shrink them down because we get focused on seeing the things that are occurring currently. That's where our focus is. And Bo Jackson suffered from that because he didn't have a huge career, and then all of a sudden it changed because of an injury. And true, he was all about athleticism. That's what carried him. He was getting to be a better baseball player, and he was just about ready to become a full-time baseball player, which would have allowed him to get to a higher level. But he was the superhero that we needed because he was an actual superhero. And once he lost his superpower, we forgot in a hurry. He did have a renaissance years later, but in that time, in that magical time when he was at its height, we all gathered around that one player. We all were focused on him, and he helped to provide us with a center as we built a card world around us. And it was critical. Thankfully for us, there happened to be a Michael Jordan waiting in the wings that we were able to shift over to, and he became the surrogate, and then we never looked back. And that was great. But the star for Bo Jackson felt so fast that it's difficult to really appreciate what he was at the time. But oh my word, he was incredible at that time. And cards would have still evolved over time, but he made life a whole lot easier for us, especially with the transition from baseball into football, because that was a critical aspect of the evolution, and he made it a lot easier. So that is one of the great stories of a person in sports, or in the sports card world, that really made a big impact. And I really do want to make sure that his story is not lost, that people are able to remember just what he meant at that time. Now, I will be continuing on talking about more stories about personalities in the world of sports cards, as well as different cards, card technology, etc. That's what this channel is here for. This channel is here to explore the great aspects of cards through the years. Not just the cards, but the experiences of the cards and the whole world around cards. So definitely subscribe to check out the other stories that we'll be coming up with, and the entries into the Sports Trading Card Hall of Fame. So definitely do that. Ring the bell so that you'll get notified about when these stories come up, when these different videos come up. Definitely check out the stories that have already come up. And yeah, thank you very much for watching.